Hear me? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then we'll kick this stuff off. All right. Kyle, can you let me know if you can see that?
Yes, I can.
All right, excellent. All right, folks. First of all, I want to thank y'all for taking some time out of your Monday evening to spend some time to listen about ecological restoration. And I titled this Ecological Restoration on a Sliding Scale primarily because I want to talk about how we manage our public lands at different levels of government and the different scales at which that management's done. Like Kyle said, my name's Sean Goff. That last name is pronounced like cough, like with a G, for those of y'all who may be wondering. And I am the land
Sorry,
stewardship
Sean.
program. Yeah.
My bad.
What's wrong?
I said your name wrong. My bad.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Hey, it happens all the time. I've been dealing with it for 37 years now. So anyway, I am the land stewardship program manager within the Raleigh Parks and Recreation and Cultural Resources Department. And before we get too far into the presentation, I want to offer a quick disclaimer. That is that this is going to be a drastic oversimplification of a lot of this stuff. But that's mainly because we have an hour and I want to hit on a lot of different topics. So we'll be skimming the surface on a lot of this stuff. I'll have my contact info up at the end of the presentation for anybody who wants to ask questions directly. And I will work with Kyle to get some of these resources shared so you guys can find some of the same information that's contained within here. A lot of this is going to be based on my experience. I've worked for different levels of government pretty much my entire professional career. I did a couple stints with North Carolina State Parks, once first as a forestry technician and then as a regional biologist. I spent some time in the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and the Division of Soil and Water Conservation as an environmental specialist. And I'm going on about a year and a half now here with Raleigh as the land stewardship manager. I don't have any federal government experience, but in my time with the state, especially, we did several dozen projects with federal agencies. So a lot of this is going to be input from my experience, and we're going to be looking at it through that lens at the different levels and how management is enacted. All right, so first, I want to talk a little bit about what ecological restoration is. And if you want to go with the Society for Ecological Restoration's definition, it is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Now, the Society for Eco Restoration has a lot more to their definition. It's pretty wordy. I just wanted to focus on that because I think a lot of people hear the term ecological restoration and maybe sort of put off by it because they think it's a lot more complicated and a lot heavier of a lift than it actually is. A lot of people assume that ecological restoration has to have a defined endpoint. You'll hear pre-colonial times or pre-industrial times or things like that. And while that may or may not be realistic in some cases, the key here is the process. It's the process of taking management steps to improve the trajectory of that ecosystem. So over here on the right, I've got some of the classic diagrams that you see, especially coming up, learning about ecology. The one on the top and the right is the classic ball and cup diagram, where basically the ecosystem is at a stable state when it's at the bottom of one of those cups. And it takes a certain amount of energy and input to push it up over that threshold and get it into a higher state or a higher cup. So in order to improve an ecosystem or to restore an ecosystem, you have to put energy and input in to move it up to that next level where then it may find another equilibrium state, or you may need to push even harder to get it up to the next level. One thing I don't like about this diagram is on the left, sort of where that white ball is headed, it really should be lower because it takes a lot less energy and input for a ecosystem to go downhill than it does for it to go uphill. On the bottom right, that's your typical population curve. And that's has a lot to do with it, whether you're talking about flora or fauna, plants or animals. So the population size of your native plants and your native wildlife populations may be involved when you're talking about ecological restoration. And so may be your population levels of invasive species or undesirable species, which is also something important to take into account. A couple important concepts I wanted to touch on real quick was the difference between ecological restoration and ecological management. I could have just as easily titled this presentation Ecological Management on a sliding scale, but management to me is such a broader term. It includes stuff like restoration. And management could entail, no action, for example, not doing anything on an ecosystem or on a property is considered management, right? That's a management decision. But so is sort of exploiting those natural resources. So whether you are logging or drilling for oil, or there's certain sustainable things that will work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything to assist the recovery of the ecosystem. Managing is sort of a blanket term. So ecological restoration versus ecological maintenance is another hair I'd like to split, where maintenance is sort of a desired state depending on what your management objectives and goals are. Ecological maintenance plays a huge part in restoration because once you get it up, let's say to that next cup, like in that upper right-hand diagram, then you're going to need to probably do things to maintain that in order to keep it from slipping back downhill into that lower state. And lastly, we're going to talk about several common restoration practices in this presentation. These are management activities that are most commonly prescribed in order to help restore or to help assist the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, whether it's through inaction or direct negative impacts. So we're going to talk about several different things that can apply regardless of what scale of government you're working at, what ecosystem you're working in. A lot of these things stay fundamental. All right, so let's dive into federal land management. Again, this is bird's eye view type stuff. So examples of the agencies that own and manage the most amount of public land at the federal level are the Bureau of Land Management, which is the biggest one. But then you have agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and I included the U.S. Department of Defense in there, not necessarily because they own and manage the most amount of land, but they do some really novel and interesting things with the land that they do manage. Two really good examples in this state are Fort Bragg near Fayetteville and Camp Lejeune down near Jacksonville, where the area within that military base or those military bases they do have land management units within them. And so they are managing their natural resources sort of almost in an encapsulated area that's free of some of the development pressures and some of the other human-related pressures. And as a result, they have some of the highest quality habitat anywhere in the state and probably on the East Coast. So I wanted to include them in there because they do a lot of land management and they help advance our knowledge on ways to manage land as well. Roughly between all these agencies, they manage about 610 million acres, which is about 28% of the land area in the United States, which is a huge amount of land to manage. Just in North Carolina, they manage 2.4 million. Most of that's in the national forest, in the western part of the state. And altogether, that covers just under 8% of the land area in North Carolina. So federal land management has a smaller fingerprint in North Carolina than it does, say, in some of the western states, the Wyomings, the Montanas, et cetera. But it's still there, and it still has a big role in not only how we manage our resources internally in the state, but also how we collaborate at different levels of the government to get the management objectives met. You can imagine with this much land, 610 million acres, they have a lot of large tracts. And as a result, they have a lot of large management units. Management unit is sort of a parcel of the entire property that you've broken down into a smaller size that's more, for lack of a better word, manageable. It's something to where you can target and write specific management prescriptions for without having to look too broadly. It helps you narrow in and get a closer scope. So when you're talking about 610 million acres, you've got a lot of room to make some pretty big management units. We're talking about anywhere from the hundreds of acres to the thousands of acres in a single unit. They are also relatively limited in the amount of wildland urban interface they have. This is where sort of the natural area that you're trying to manage runs up against, residential, commercial, or transportation, some sort of human habitation that may confine you in terms of the management activities you can do, the timing of when you can do them. And out, in the West and the rangelands, especially, there's a lot less people. So there's a lot less chance that you're going to run up against something like that's going to constrain you. So again, you're able to practice your management over larger scales, larger units, and to employ some different techniques than we could say here in the city of Raleigh. Of course, at the federal level, you get into federal politics. And as we know, depending on the administration that's in or what sort of impact, natural resource corporations and industries may have, it can be very highly political in terms of how the land is managed, what land is managed, and how we sort of move forward and sometimes go backwards in terms of how we protect these lands. Now let's go down a little bit closer to the state level. And more specifically, I'm going to focus a lot when I talk about these state level managements about the state of North Carolina, not only because that's where I think most of us are, but that's where I spend most of my time working. So it helps provide maybe a little bit more context, but I'll try to talk about equivalencies in other states for where I can. An example of that are just like the agencies that we have. The agencies that own and manage the most amount of land in North Carolina are the North Carolina Forest Service, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, that manage all the game lands, and the North Carolina State Parks. So there are equivalents in other states. For example, I know in Virginia, I think their Forest Service and their Wildlife Resources are a little bit more intertwined. So even though there may be different models, pretty much every state has some type of agents or set of agencies that help manage the land and the natural resources there. Between these agencies, they manage about 804,000 acres in North Carolina, which is about 2.5%. So we're still talking big tracts and potentially big management units, but we're not talking anywhere in the size of usually at the federal level. We're talking more into the hundreds to maybe few hundred, maybe there's a handful of management units that I've worked on that were in the 1,200 acre range, but even those are outliers within the state of North Carolina. And of course, things could be different if you were on the other side of the country. When you get into the state level management, you're talking about increased WUI, which is that wildland urban interface. A lot of people call it WUI, which is just a fun thing to say, but you'll see that come up a handful of times in this presentation. And again, that's sort of that human pressure that where you have cities and towns and schools and highways where you need to take a step back and look at your management actions and see how they're going to impact public safety, public health, and make sure that they're also meeting your management goals. So you got to play with your prescriptions a little bit more when you're getting down to this level. At the state level, it's less political. I'm not saying it's totally not political. There's definitely still some influence, but it's not, doesn't drive land management, at least in North Carolina, as much as it does, say, at the federal level. Finally, we're going to talk about sort of local or municipality land management. This could be your counties, your cities, your towns, even sort of regional and district if you want to get to that. How many acres in the US are under local or municipality land management? I have no idea. I don't know how you would find that information. It was hard enough for me to find information from North Carolina, and I still didn't feel good enough about it to put it in the presentation. You can imagine it's so very fragmented that in order to collect all that information, it would probably take a federal agency or something like that. Of course, you're getting down to these smaller areas. That means smaller tracts and smaller management units. And I'll show you some good examples of that here later when we talk about some of the specific management practices. The big reason for that is our higher density of WUI, whether that's residencies, commercial areas, transportation routes. That wildland urban interface plays a much bigger role at the local and municipality or municipal level than it does at the state or federal level. And again, this is an oversimplification. Everywhere is different. But in places like North Carolina that is rapidly developing, we're running out of places where you don't have a wildland urban interface, where you don't have that WUI. So it's always in mind. It's always going to be a major consideration. It's always something that's going to affect your management prescriptions, your ability to restore, or even maintain an ecosystem. Local politics can have a major influence here. Now, I think you see the spike in political influence go up, maybe from the state level. And a lot of that has more to do with land use. So, for example, if we have a nice pristine area that we think is high quality habitat, great examples of natural resources, we may want to turn that into a nature preserve. But, somebody from city council decides that that should be the next rec center. It's hard for us to fight against that because you're talking about different user groups. Different user groups have different, and different stakeholders have different amounts of influence. And so there is local politics that go on that may drive your management abilities and your ability to restore systems. All right, now we're going to get into those common management practices, those common restoration practices, I should say, that going back to that definition we talked about, assist the recovery of these ecosystems. First and foremost, this is the first thing I recommend whenever I'm getting into management, planning or writing prescriptions, and that's ecological monitoring, which of course is an extremely broad term. It can encompass tons of different techniques and strategies. But what I'm talking about more specifically is stuff like biological surveys, where you're going around and you're sampling the different populations, whether they be plants or animals. Once you identify these populations, you also have to determine what the health of these populations are. It's not enough whether they're there or not. You need to know sort of what the trend in terms of their general health and condition is. You can also use monitoring to check for the presence or absence of rare or protected plants or animals, which you need to know that they're on your site so you can manage them accordingly. Other examples are habitat quality surveys. So this is when you're sort of zooming out from just the abiotic factors and looking more at some of the abiotic factors. You're doing things like forest measurements. You don't want a forest that's overstocked with too many trees, that doesn't allow the sunlight to get down, doesn't promote herbaceous ground cover, which is the grasses and forbs and wildflowers that are the highest quality resources for wildlife. Stuff like water quality assessments for aquatic habitats, pollutants, sedimentation, all these things you need to know through monitoring. And also you can identify different habitat suitability and connectivity issues through computer modeling, which is something that's coming along now. And it helps you use more remote sensing in order to predict how management actions or land acquisitions, for example, may help improve habitat or connect habitat, which is a very important topic that we're going to talk about here soon. Monitoring helps you ID invasive species on the property or in the tract. Early detection and rapid response is a common phrase that you'll hear in invasive species control, basically meaning the sooner you find it and the quicker you can handle it, the easier it'll be. If you let an invasive plant species or pest species population grow to the point where it gets out of control, then it may no longer be practical or feasible to eradicate or control that. You may just be trying to keep it at a status quo, and it becomes more of a reactive management than it does proactive. Seasonal monitoring obviously is important because sometimes, different invasives are more conspicuous during different times of year. Same thing for our native plants. If you're walking around the springtime and you notice the strange flower that you've never seen before, looks kind of out of place, well, you may have identified an invasive species simply because it had the flower. Ordinarily, if it wasn't flowering, you may have walked right by it. On the other side of the coin, we have in the wintertime different evergreen invasive plants like Chinese privet and English ivy that are a lot easier to see in the wintertime when everything else is sort of died and browned away, making treatment and ID of those invasives a lot easier. And lastly, another thing that ecological monitoring will help you assess is whether there's any unauthorized access or use going on in the property. And that could be illegal hunting or poaching. And poaching obviously doesn't necessarily apply just to animals or just to wildlife. We have a lot of problems with plant poaching. When I worked for North Carolina State Parks, down in Onslow and Pender County, we have a big property called Sandy Run Savannas that had a lot of Venus flytraps, where we would find four-wheeler tracks and gates that have been broke down where people were coming in and they were stealing the Venus flytraps, I'm assuming to turn around and then sell them. But because of the issue and because of the problem, not just in that site, but all throughout that region, they ended up making it a felony to poach Venus flytraps. So different, we would have never known that. We would have never known all that was going on if we weren't actively monitoring the site. And it also helps you identify other degrading factors, whether that's off property discharge, stormwater discharge, or something that's not supposed to be emptying onto the property, or nearby development or construction, something like that that's impacting it from off-site. All these things you wouldn't know unless you're actively out there looking to see what you have on site. And anything you find is going to help gauge and help guide your next management decisions as far as some of these future practices. All right, invasive species management. Now, of course, this is another huge thing. We're referring not only to invasive plants, but also to invasive pests. And as many of you probably already know, invasive species are one of the greatest threats to native biodiversity, not just in the nation, but worldwide. They can severely damage ecological processes, not just by displacing native plants, but they can actually reduce certain elements to the point where the ecological processes such as water filtration, air quality, flood control, some of these things are no longer intact. And we lose that service that was provided by our native plants and our native animals. We spend millions of dollars in a year, whether it's in controlling invasive species or in losses to different agricultural commodities or other industries created directly by invasive plants and invasive pests. In order to remove some of these invasive plants and pests, you can go through a couple different control methods. These are all broad, sort of general headers. There's a lot more specifics under each of these, but mechanical controls refers more to physically removing that invasive from the environment. So this works a lot more, as you can imagine, for plants, whether you are cutting or mowing or even just hand pulling, removing the roots and getting that plant off site. A little bit more difficult for things like insects, invasive insects. You can't go around and grab every single one and remove them, although in some cases, that does help if it's practical. Chemical control is probably the most common, maybe the most practical in some cases, and often comes with the greatest amount of responsibility. I think most of us are familiar with or have heard, what's going on in the news with different herbicides, stuff like glyphosate and Roundup. So there's a lot of negative stigma, deserved or not, that go along with using herbicides and pesticides. So when you're using chemicals to restore an environment, not only do you want to keep the public health and the applicator health and safety in mind, but you also want to make sure you're not causing any more harm that's not going to help you reach your goal of assisting that ecosystem recovery. Biological controls is another exciting thing that's coming along the last couple of decades. And that's where you're using a biological agent, say like a predator, from where this invasive species which originally came from, to help reduce and control populations of the invasives here. Good example, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the emerald ash borer. This is a little wood boring beetle that has basically decimated ash trees all along the east coast. It's moving inland. It doesn't seem like we're going to be able to stop it, so now we're more about managing it. But some of the promising avenues are using parasitic wasps that either prey on the larvae or the adults, or they'll lay eggs, use them as a host for their eggs. That will actually help reduce the populations of emerald ash borer. But all these things are in early research stage. I don't know of any widespread releases of biocontrol agents, but I do know of some small scale releases. So we're moving towards that. Hopefully we can get more into that in the future. That'll reduce demand for some of the chemical controls we were talking about just a minute ago. And lastly, we can talk about cultural controls, and this is more about our behavior. What do we do to help the spread and propagation of some of these invasive species, whether it's not using invasive plants and landscaping, being responsible and cautious about how you move around firewood, what you bring in and out of the country, in and out of the state. So all these things that we can really do to help ourselves get a hold of these. A lot of that comes with public education and awareness. So that's a big part. Once people are aware and once people buy in, typically they're willing to change their behaviors, as long as it's not too much of an inconvenience. But there's ways we can work together to institute some more of these cultural controls to help control some of these big problems. All right, next general management prescription would be for community and habitat management. I broke these down even further into wildlife and vegetation management. So when you're talking wildlife management, you're talking specifically, well, not specifically, usually you're talking about how you're going to manage protected species. That comes along somewhere down the line because those are the ones who have been identified as either being rare or imperiled enough to where they need legal protections. You're also talking about how you're going to manage game species, different hunting. These are some of the more abundant species, and it can, typically drive a lot of hunting revenue and stuff like that. So you need to figure out how you're going to manage that and regulate that. You deal with nuisance species, which are, that's a very subjective term. Nuisance species, it really depends on how this animal is impacting you and your own personal life. It could be anywhere from raccoons in your trash to white-tailed deer eating your plants in your garden, to coyotes, running away with your cat. So there's a lot of different levels of nuisance. Um, with wildlife management, you're almost always talking population control, whether that is decreasing, increasing, or maintaining certain levels of populations. You're talking about the different habitats that are available and how these habitats are connected so that different animals can move, can disperse, and hopefully expand their range. And we're talking terrestrial and aquatic habitats. So not just the stuff that we can see and walk around, but we're talking about, freshwater and saltwater habitats. Vegetation management, again, can be broken down even further to woody vegetation and herbaceous vegetation. Woody vegetation is your trees, your shrubs, woody vines, stuff like that. Herbaceous is more of your grasses and your forbs, your wildflowers. Both equally important and both require different types of management. In both cases, you're really trying to achieve quality habitat. That's usually the number one objective when you're talking about community and habitat management, is improving that quality and increasing that capacity for more of whatever your target species is. By doing that, you're increasing wildlife resources, you're hopefully bolstering your native populations, and you are protecting species. Not just animals that are protected that have legal protections, but there's a lot of plants as well that have legal protections. So those need to be accounted for when planning for vegetation management activities. All right, and the last broad management tool is prescribed fire. A lot of times you'll hear prescribed fire and controlled burning used interchangeably, and they can pretty much mean the same thing. One of the reasons why we use prescribed fire is because fire is a natural process on the landscape, especially here in the southeastern United States. In the past, there were frequent fires. They were ignited by lightning or sometimes by indigenous people who used fire as a land management tool as well. We've learned through dendrochronology, soil studies, a bunch of different disciplines of scientific disciplines that fires in the southeast United States would have burned at variable intensities, at least every 1 to 5 years. So fire was frequent enough on the landscape to help shape ecosystems, to help shape the plants and animals that actually lived and thrived in them. And actually, over the course of time, some of these plants and animals become dependent on fire. A good example is this little longleaf pine seedling that's here in the picture that needs fire essentially to thrive and to grow. It'll grow on its own, but without fire, it's really not going to be as hardy and as healthy as it would be. Longleaf pine is a sort of poster child for the fire-prone ecosystem. And fire suppression over years, as we tried our best to keep fire out of the forest, we ended up degrading these forests and these other systems to the point where they were no longer what they originally were. So by restoring fire, we're hopefully going to be restoring some of the positive benefits, some of the ecological pressures and impacts that came along with fire in the past. We're mimicking a natural disturbance, so it's important for us to apply fire in a natural way. We're not trying to burn on the hottest day of the year, necessarily on the coldest day of the year, or on the same day of the year every year. We're trying to switch it up. We're trying to introduce different seasonality, different intensities, in order to achieve what natural fire would have done. And of course, with something like prescribed fire, you need to have clear objectives. You need to have an idea of exactly why you're lighting the fire, what it is you hope to achieve, and you need to make sure you're doing it safely, especially in areas where there's a lot of that wildland urban interface and where smoke management becomes crucial. But a lot of people are more worried about where the flames are going in a prescribed fire, and it's a lot easier sometimes to manage that than it is to manage where your smoke is going. And you can imagine if your smoke drifts over to a school or a hospital or a residential area or a heavy transportation route like Interstate 40, it could cause a lot of problems. So smoke management is very crucial depending on where you are. So now let's look at how some of these practices are applied at different levels. This is sort of where the sliding scale comes in. Even though these are the same management practices and the same basic prescriptions, we can't apply them all the same way because we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of acres at the federal level to maybe 1 acre at the local level. So we're going to have to be able to adjust and zoom in and zoom out as we need. Ecological monitoring, going back to that first one, at the federal level, of course, we're talking millions of acres again. I think it was 610 million acres. How are you going to keep a pulse on all of that? How are you going to keep an eye on all of that? And you really can't. So in order to do the best job they can, most federal agencies have access to really good technology. A lot of technology is used for remote sensing, so different GIS applications. They have the ability to take aerial photographs. They have satellite imagery. They even have computer models that help them predict how different land management activities will impact the plant and animal populations in those areas. And a lot of these models, they're coming to find out, are increasingly accurate. We're getting better and better at doing some of these models. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see some of the other cool toys they have, like these thermal imaging cameras. This is a pack of wild pigs, feral pigs that are not around here. This is likely maybe from somewhere further south, Louisiana, Texas, something like that. But I just thought this was a neat picture, and I'd love to have something like this to where we could go out and monitor our sites with thermal imaging to catch some of these more, nocturnal species. But all this ultimately leads to a reduction in fine scale surveys and sampling. So you're not going to be able to get a fine tooth comb over every acre of your 610 million acres. You have to find a way to sort of get the job done and get the important information that you need collected at a scale that works for you. Going down to the state level. So we still have millions of acres to monitor, and that still means we're going to need a lot of remote sensing. Like in the bottom right-hand corner, at the state level, we have the ability to take aerial photographs, and drone photography is actually coming in handy a lot. Especially like this is a beetle kill patch, southern pine beetle, that was up in the mountains of North Carolina, that was identified through a drone, but on the ground, it would have been almost impossible to get to because this was hundreds of miles, maybe not, I think it was dozens of miles away from the closest access point. It was about 100 miles away from the closest town. So this was just sort of the spot in the middle of nowhere that would never have been found without some of these remote sensing techniques that we have. At the state level, your on the ground surveying and sampling becomes a lot more critical. And one big reason for that is because of the regulatory and oversight responsibilities that are assumed at the state level. So there is federal regulations, obviously, for a lot of these things, but the states then further define their laws and regulations as it comes to environmental policy. Whether that's for water quality, air quality, or the protected species, you need to be able to have people on the ground conducting these tests, doing these surveys, taking these samples in order to better conduct your oversight and to create these regulations that'll help protect these resources. Now let's get down to the smallest level, local monitoring. Of course, now this is where fine scale surveys and sampling become possible, but also become necessary. This is where we're talking about much smaller tracts, so it becomes much more important to know what we have so that we can manage these tracts, appropriately. We don't want to come to find out that we had something that, based on poor management decisions, we ended up losing. If we would have known it was there, if we would have done monitoring appropriately, we would have been able to get there and take place or put in the proper protections and take care of that species. We still use some remote sensing, but a lot of that's more GIS type stuff. Preliminary site recon helps you identify some of the areas you want to get on the ground to, where there may be some of the either degrading factors or maybe the highest potential for rare or protected species. There is some local regulatory and oversight responsibilities, such as the different zoning and development ordinances, how we manage stormwater. And a lot of that requires that on-the-ground fine scale sampling to make sure that you're seeing direct impacts. Um, and at the local level, you typically have reduced resources when compared to the state and federal level, whether that's with the technology you have, the number of staff, and the type of equipment you have. So that ultimately causes us to rely a lot more on partnerships. And those partnerships could be with state or federal agencies, or local organizations like NGOs, non-government organizations, conservation organizations, land trust, people who can help provide us bodies and equipment to get out there and monitor these sites and make sure we're making the best management decisions possible. All right, moving into the next one. Invasive species management at the federal level. Well, you can imagine that this is another huge job, given the amount of land and the responsibility that the federal agencies have. Most of the time, you'll see the federal agencies focused on those invasive species that pose the greatest threats to agricultural commodities, the ability to ship and carry out transportation, different public utilities, and public health. So when you're talking about what invasive species pose the greatest threats to those types of infrastructure, you're really talking mostly about invasive wildlife. That is what they focus, I would say 75% of their efforts and resources on. They still focus on invasive plants, obviously, but invasive plants can't move around as easily as invasive wildlife can. You have terrestrial and aquatic species like the zebra mussel up there that's creating all sorts of biodiversity issues in aquatic habitats. They think it was introduced somewhere in the Great Lakes and now it's migrating its way down freshwater streams and rivers. But filter feeds out a lot of the nutrients and algae that other native plants need, and it creates a lot of issues on water intakes, whether that's for public drinking water or nuclear power plants. I think have a lot of problems with these mussels colonizing around these pipes, so that creates the need to go out and then remove them later. In the bottom right-hand corner, you have the spotted lanternfly, excuse me, which is another really scary pest that the federal agencies are all over, mainly because it has such a wide range of host plants. So a lot of invasive plants will focus in on one type of plant, one genus, one family, but the lanternfly here can negatively impact all sorts of woody trees and plants, and a lot of them are very high commodity. So we're talking orchards, whether it's grapes, apples, nuts like almonds, all the way up to industrial lumber like pine trees. So this is a very scary pest, and they can move. They don't pay any attention to state boundaries or regional boundaries. They can move wherever the resource is for them. So that's one of the big things federal agencies have to worry about are these invasive wildlife. They have a lot of regulatory tools with them. They have within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they have the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, that's APHIS. Their job is to go around and basically keep tabs on a lot of these invasive species and help ID different mitigating factors. How can we help reduce this, whether it's through commercial shipping routes or maybe even regional quarantines, which have proven to be effective in slowing the spread of some of these things, but not necessarily in stopping the spread. So let's move to the state level. We lose our focus. The focus becomes less more about invasive wildlife and more of a even mix, where you're focused on the greatest threats statewide, whether they be plant or wildlife. Invasive plants are a greater concern at the state level because we're always looking for new introductions. We have invasive plant councils, at least we have one here in North Carolina and one in South Carolina, and I think other states have similar models, where they can basically work together to identify not only which invasive plants are creating the greatest threat, but how can we go about mitigating, reducing, or controlling these plants. Obviously, they still manage for invasive wildlife, but a lot of those initiatives are in collaboration with federal agencies. At the state level, they do have some different regulatory tools. They can help control and regulate interstate commerce. So if they don't want an invasive species moving, let's say from one county to another, they can do county quarantines, which again are proven to slow the spread, but not necessarily stop the spread. They can come up with noxious weed lists, which are sort of your do not plant list. So if you are a government contractor, service provider, these are plants you can no longer plant. They're plants that are taking off of the DOT planting list, for example, which a lot of our really bad invasive plants came from the DOT. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a little bit. And it requires a lot of regional or county collaborations where we can identify plants and animals that are impacting more than one county or more than one municipal region, and we can work together to help sort of regulate how things are moving in these regions and what we can do to reduce the threat of these invasors. All right, and now let's look at invasive management at the local level. This is where it typically gets fun. We focus almost entirely on invasive plants. We do focus on the management for invasive pests, but again, a lot of that is with assistance and support from either their state or federal agencies, because we just don't have the resources to go around and really control some of these things. Invasive plants, they don't move around as much, so they're a little easy to get on top of. But one of the biggest problems when you're at the local level is that wildland-urban interface again, that WUI pops up and creates a lot of source populations, especially for invasive plants. Whether that's using non-native plants for your landscaping, or again, sometimes when you're seeding after a construction project or a road project and you're introducing plants that way, then those plants then spread onto our public lands, like our parks and nature preserves, and we're spending time and money to then control them. So over here on the right, this big sign was a sign that we created earlier this year, maybe late last year, that we had to put out at one of our sites because we had so many neighbors dragging their lawn cuttings, their trimmings from their bushes, all of their yard waste, and just dumping it into one of our nature preserves. And of course, that area, they've been doing it for years, and that area is now just one of the most concentrated, tied up, nasty looking sources or populations of invasive plants, and all sorts of ones too, like things you wouldn't see anywhere else. And it all comes from these people's yards because they walk out, they don't realize the impact they're having by just disposing of some yard waste. So we put these signs up to hopefully discourage them from, disposing of their yard waste on our site so that we can maybe finally get control of some of these invasive plants that are popping up there. Because of where you are and because of the different types of land use, you have to be able to balance that land use with the need for control and develop a realistic scope for control. So if there's a nice new facility and they want to plant a non-native plant in the landscaping, or possibly you want to use fescue grass, something that's going to get mowed, then you almost have to accept a certain level of artificiality at the local level, because it's not practical to say, no, we can't have any invasive plants in these areas, because that's just not going to work. So you need to find ways to eliminate the ones that are the biggest problems and sort of accept and maintain and manage around the ones that are going to be there no matter what. Of course, just like at the state level, there's fewer resources here. So that means there's more opportunity for collaborations, whether that's with other agencies and organizations or with the public and communities, to help them or to have them help us manage these invasives on city properties. All right, now we're getting into wildlife management. So wildlife management, again, very broad term, could mean a lot of different things. At the federal level, typically one of the things they're most focused on are the federally protected species. These are the species that have, again, have been identified to either be rare or imperiled enough to where they need legal protections. They are also managing, extremely large protected areas, and that's providing a great amount of habitat. National parks, wildlife refuges, the different national monuments throughout the country. We have estuaries and marine protected areas. So we're able to provide these huge areas of habitat that hopefully will keep some of the natural processes intact, some of the food webs, some of the predator and prey relationships. So aside from being able to place some of the legal protections, hopefully by maintaining these large protected areas, we're giving them enough room to sort of develop and progress on their own, and maybe need a little less active management, a little bit more passive management and monitoring. At the federal level, you also have to be wary of major migrations that may go across multiple states. For example, like the elk migrations out west, where you need to identify these areas. You need to work with local agencies and private landowners. You need to make sure that the necessary protections are installed. All these things are extremely huge logistical challenges, especially over millions of acres. And that's just part of being at the federal level, is how do you manage something on that scale? And big part of that is the regulatory tools that they have. They have a bigger hammer than we do, down here at the city level, for example. And some of the more common ones that you may be familiar with are the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act, which helps set the stage for different regulations and different standards that can then be built on by different states. But these are sort of your baseline, big bucket regulations that help them achieve wildlife management at such a large scale. Going down to the state scale, again, we're focused on protected species still, but not just those that are federally listed, but many states have their own state list too, like North Carolina has a state threatened and state endangered list as well. You'll see the states most often responsible for developing their own watch list, which are the species that are not quite listed yet. They're not considered threatened or endangered, but they are on the way. And so different states will create their different watch list just to sort of be proactive in the management and not playing catch up when it comes to restoring these populations. A lot of states are in charge of the reintroductions to a protected species. And a great example that you guys are probably familiar with are the red wolves that were somewhat unsuccessfully reintroduced in the northeast part of the state. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of negative public perception. There was a lot of mortality due to hunting and car strikes, interbreeding with coyotes. So there were a lot of difficult challenges that were addressed at the state level. And now I believe they still have the captive breeding program. I don't think they've completely abandoned the reintroductions, but these are all things that are handled at the state level because they are state initiatives. This is something that our Wildlife Resources Commission deemed to be an important project. It was driven mainly by internal partners and stakeholders internal to the state. There's a lot of cooperative management in protected areas. So there's a lot of areas where state-owned and federal-owned and even locally owned property runs into each other or even overlaps. And so there's a lot of need for state regulatory agencies like the Wildlife Resources Commission to be able to manage these areas and to be able to cross over and have jurisdiction over all of them so that they can manage them cooperatively. We're typically looking at regional habitat suitability and connectivity instead of sort of on a national scale. Now you're bringing it down to a more regional scale, making sure that the different, not only the wildlife, but the plants that you have there have suitable habitat, have adequate habitat, and room to move with those connections and corridors we talked about. At the state level, there are regulatory tools also. They can set certain hunting and trapping regulations, whether that's for game species or even, no hunting at all for protected species. We do have law enforcement capabilities, the wildlife resources, the game wardens. I think that's the most common model that you'll see in other states. And environmental standards for development. How will your development or your construction project impact wildlife in the area? So we're able to set some of those standards too in order to better manage them at the state level. Now, when you get down to the local level, again, I hate to say it, but that wildland-urban interface, the dynamic between wildlife and development, that becomes huge. It really drives 90% of your management decisions, because how are you going to appropriately address a management problem unless you realize, that typically it's related somehow to whether it's human habitation directly or indirectly. You're looking at habitat suitability and connectivity again, but this time with a more critical eye, because it's really important that we have, these islands of green essentially in a sea of urbanization. And we need to make sure that these islands are big enough, and we need to make sure that they're connected. We need to make sure that the corridors are in place so that the animals that are confined by all the development and urbanization at least have that system of habitat and corridors to get around and, to function as they typically would, albeit a lot more restricted. Wildlife corridors, especially in Raleigh and the Raleigh area, the greenway system has been so valuable in connecting not only our parks and preserves and other undeveloped sites, but also providing habitat as well. Because a lot of people may think that the greenway is, this 40-foot swath linear with a paved path in the middle, but really a lot of these greenway tracks incorporate a lot more acreage that many people don't even see. So greenways act as a huge source of habitat and connections. Utility right-of-ways, where you see power lines and sewer lines, those act as corridors as well. And riparian areas along streams and rivers. So it's very important that we are keeping an eye on these areas and protecting these areas in order to make sure that the wildlife species can move as appropriate. The natural areas, these corridors are connecting natural areas, essentially the different parks, nature preserves, and developed sites where the habitat may be a little bit more expansive. There may be a few more resources, and this may be where the wildlife tends to hang out for a little bit longer. But sooner or later, they're going to need to move on. So those corridors are going to take them to that next natural area or that next natural green island that lies out there. And of course, at the local level, you run into that nuisance animal designation a lot more. Again, whether it's raccoons or possums or something in your trash can, or in a worse sense, potentially rabid foxes, which have become a problem in some parts, some counties. We had a unique one here in Raleigh. That bottom right-hand picture is of a sign that we had to put out at one of our sites where a lady was actually buzzed by a red-shouldered hawk that was nesting. The lady was unaware that the nest was in the tree above her. She let her dog off the leash to run around. She put the dog back on the leash and started to walk away. And as she had her back turned to the nest, all of a sudden this hawk came and knocked her hat off. So some people may consider that nuisance wildlife. A lot of people would consider it just being protective parent, but these are the different things that you won't see necessarily at the state and certainly usually not at the federal level that pop up when you're looking at local management when humans and wildlife are so close together. All right, vegetation management. At the federal level, again, we're talking huge tracts, a lot of acres to manage, and so they can do landscape level management, whether that's timber harvesting, which some people may not see timber harvesting as a restoration practice, but depending on how it's applied, it absolutely can be. Good examples are in the Southeast United States anyway, where areas that would have typically been populated by longleaf pine have been encroached on by loblolly pine, and it's almost become a dominant stand of loblolly, which is not, it is a native pine, but it doesn't necessarily belong in some of these sites where the longleaf pine would have been. It's our lack of fire and our lack of other management that has allowed these trees to come in to where they're not necessarily site appropriate. So in order to get rid of them, you can do a restoration harvest where you're going in and you're removing the sort of undesirable plants and trees, and you're leaving the desirable stuff and making room for you to plant and grow more. Ranching and grazing is another big vegetation management tool that, especially out west, that the federal government uses. That creates its own set of political issues as well, but that's sort of the system. Hundreds, thousands of years ago, we had these large ungulates out there. We had bison, we had elk, we had all these things out there. And the impact that they had on vegetation management, especially herbaceous vegetation management, was huge. So allowing some of the cattle and livestock that we have out there now, it's somewhat mimicking what we had there, but nowhere near the same scale. Controlled burns are something that they can use on landscape levels where you can burn, thousands of acres at a time if you are doing it appropriately and safely. And that's a huge vegetation management tool. And obviously, they're dealing with the shared use of open resources in a lot of these huge public lands at the federal level. So whether that is the ranching or it is timber harvesting or fossil fuel extraction, that's something that they have to worry about frequently out there when it comes to vegetation management. They can set their own standards for agriculture and development in terms of what sort of agricultural chemicals can be used, what sort of water use and what sort of water use techniques are available and how it's used, and where the protected areas are for different types of vegetation. Again, not just animals are protected. There's a lot of plants that are under the ESA and different types of regulatory legislation. See, at the federal level, there's a lot of collaboration with different states, different industries, and really with private landowners. Without this collaboration, the federal government wouldn't be able to reach their management goals and objectives. The collaboration is not always easy, at least not with the private landowners, but a lot of that has to do with competing interest. So you have to work with your stakeholders and find common ground. And at the federal level, that can involve hundreds of stakeholders. So a lot more complicated, a lot more moving pieces. Vegetation management at the state level. So we still have some landscape level management opportunities. We do have some timber harvest that we can do, some of those restoration timber harvest I was telling you about. In fact, we did a few when I was with North Carolina State Parks to help solve exactly that problem I was talking about, where the lack of fire and management had allowed some trees to establish that were not necessarily site appropriate. Although they were native, they shouldn't have been there in that abundance and that distribution if we had allowed the natural processes to take place. The different fire and different natural disturbances that would have gone on without our intervention. Controlled burns at the landscape level. I don't know if I'd call it landscape level, but it's close. We've done some controlled burns, 6, 7, 800 acres. So that's getting close to landscape level. Vegetation management in the state also incorporates agricultural and development standards, again, with the chemicals they can use, how water is used, and what areas are protected. And at the state level, there's often a lot of environmental initiatives get launched. Really popular one, and one you guys have probably seen a lot, is the DOT Wildflower Program, which I'll circle back to the invasive species issue, where, a long time ago, DOT, as they did all their different road work, would use non-native plants to seed road shoulders, different areas of land that were disturbed. And so these non-native plants, unbeknownst to them at the time, just blew up, just exploded and took over and established everywhere. And some of them are so pervasive now that you really can't get rid of them. So we like to joke that the DOT Wildflower Program is sort of them trying to make amends for all the things that they've inadvertently introduced over time. But in the state level, you also have to deal a lot with agriculture, especially in a state like North Carolina. So how your vegetation is impacted by water use and spray drift from agricultural chemicals, for example, becomes a big issue and something that you have to look at. And finally, as I mentioned before, we can do a lot of initiatives to encourage people to landscape with native plants, reduce the source populations of some of those non-native invasive plants. And, native plants are best for our native insects, our native pollinators. So we should be using them anyway. That's something that I feel strongly about, and hopefully we're pushing more at the local level now too, not just at the state level. And speaking of the local level, here we are with smaller tracts and smaller units. Again, a lot of it's because we're so carved up by the different urbanization and wildland urban interface. So in that upper right-hand corner, this is a map of Horseshoe Farm Nature Preserve here in Raleigh. And you can see, in order to achieve the objectives, we've had to slice and dice this thing up into itty bitty pieces, just so we can apply different management techniques to these different management units in order to get the restoration or maintenance goals that we've prescribed. So when you're working out, out west for BLM, you can have one big square unit of 1,000 acres by 1,000 acres. Here we may have a quarter-acre unit that gets some treatment totally different from the quarter-acre unit that's right next door. So a lot more logistical challenges, a lot more moving pieces, and a lot more incremental management. That creates a higher need for precision, making sure that you're applying the restoration and the management tools correctly and at the right time. And you need to be able to adapt. So even though you have this management prescription, you have all your activities in place, or your planning in place, when it comes time to pull the trigger, it may not be doable. There may be some challenge, something that's popped up that you had no way of predicting. And a lot of that happens frequently at the local level because, again, there's so much human interface and there's so many moving pieces. We do get to set some standards for agriculture and development. We are able to designate some protected areas, and there are local ordinances and regulations in terms of development and how it could impact the vegetation. So tree protection areas is a good example here in Raleigh, where new developments are required to set aside a certain amount of land for tree protection. That helps manage and helps keep some of the canopy coverage that we have in the city, hopefully helps maintain some of the trees, and maybe even reduce some of the impervious surface area that goes up. So there's ways we try our best to help regulate this, but it's made a lot more difficult with all the stakeholders and different influences. All right, getting towards the end. This is the last technique we're talking about. Prescribed fire at the federal level. Again, zooming back out to large tracts, that combined with limited wildland urban face means you can have large burn units. So if you look down in that bottom right-hand corner, this is an example of a burn unit from out west, where you can see that these are, hundreds, if not thousands acre tracts that they're going to burn at one time. Not all of these individually, they'll burn one unit at a time, but each of these units could swallow, the city of Raleigh. These are huge units that they're able to do without much concern in terms of where their smoke goes, where their fire's going. They've got adequate control lines built all the way around. So it's it's a bigger job in terms of the area that you're going to cover and the amount of resources you may need. But in terms of complexity and surprises, there are fewer of those, believe it or not, at the federal level. They have additional resources at the federal level, such as airplanes and helicopters that can drop ignition sources, like the little ping pong balls that will drop and ignite, and that can start your fire there. So you don't actually have to have people walking, hundreds of miles in order to hand light some of these burn areas. There's a reduced need for mop up, which is basically once the prescribed fire is done and out, you go around and you make sure that there's nothing left smoking, there's no chance of reignition. And out there in these huge wild areas, that's not as big of a concern as it is, say, at the local area, where if something were to flame back up, or if there were to be a smoke management issue later in the evening, when smoke tends to get closer to the surface, that could create all sorts of problems. And at the federal level, they don't really have to worry about them as much. The federal level also has the luxury of a catalog of long-term observations that have been going on these different sites for years and sometimes decades. So they have a lot of data to look back and say, okay, this is how this property or this park or this tract has progressed over time. How can we adapt our management in order to make sure we're still getting it to where it needs to be? As far as prescribed fire goes, depending on what part of the country you're in, you may see a lot of it or you may see none of it. Down here in the Southeast United States, we use prescribed fire a lot, probably more than any other part in the country. That's not to say we're the only place appropriate for it. There are a huge amount of fire-prone and fire-adapted ecosystems here in the Southeast, again, because of the fire history over eons that help shape that. But then you go out west, where you see all these wildfire issues, especially in California, Nevada. These are very fire-prone systems too, and these should have prescribed fire and controlled burns applied to them as well. But for whatever reason, be it competing interest, politics on that scale, just being behind in terms of land management, best management practices, they don't do it quite as much out there. And a result is some of these catastrophic wildfires that we see. Prescribed fire is really important in reducing that wildfire risk. And the more you can do it and do it safely, the less chance you have for something like that. A huge wildfire that's popped up and burns fuel that has accumulated for decades. Those are the ones that get really out of hand and really dangerous really quickly. At the federal level, they're also responsible for wildfire control. So going back to what we were just talking about, their attention and resources may be divided. So even though they may want to introduce prescribed fire more out in the western states, they may not be able to because of the wildfire risk and the demand for resources there. And prescribed fire in general, and this is again an oversimplification, is less of a focus there than it is in some regional and state levels, as I was alluding to earlier. At the state level, we're talking about less land, We're starting to increase our WUI, or wildland urban interface. So that means smaller burn units, but it doesn't mean itty bitty burn units. As you can see here in the upper left, this is a picture of a burn unit out at Falls Lake Game Lands, which is wildlife resources. It's about 643 acres. So that's a pretty big burn unit to burn in one time. But again, because of where they are, they're not too close to habitation. You can see some residential areas over there on the right, east of the unit. But to the west and to the north is mostly Falls Lake, which gives them plenty of room for the smoke to get up and to get out. And additionally, as they burn towards the lake, the fire is not going to escape that way. So when you have land management units this size, it's a lot easier to pull off land management and prescribe fire at that scale. On the right, this is a burn that I actually conducted at Umstead State Park, and 40 acres, that says 40 aces, 40 acres is a big unit comparatively for some of the things we're trying to do at the local level, but still not huge compared to, the one over at Falls Lake or anything that they do at the federal level. You have to manage as you can as appropriate for the setting that you're in. So we were lucky to get the 40-acre unit burn, but it was still a lot of planning and a lot of hand-wringing that went into that because we are right there at Umstead. It's right there beside the airport and a lot of major highways. In order to sort of apply, plan, and implement prescribed fire appropriately, a lot of states work together. They create compacts and different resource sharing networks to where they can lend tools and equipment and manpower just in order to make sure that the state next door is meeting their objectives as well. The state is still responsible at some level for wildfire control, although typically, depending on the scale, the size, and the severity of the wildfire, you could get federal resources involved there too. And just like it does in the country, the use of prescribed fire varies between states and regions, just because there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of negative public perception, things like that that may draw attention away and resources away from prescribed fire and controlled burning, albeit every state's different, but we're more and more starting to come around to the benefits of this, and I hope to see it applied more and more of a national prescribed fire sort of initiative as we move into the future. All right, prescribed fire here in the city of Raleigh at the local level. As you can see, the map on the left, much smaller burn units. This is another one where we had to slice it and dice it in order to get our management objectives met. Each one of these small shapes represents a different burn unit. You can see it ranges anywhere from 3/10 of an acre up to 16 acres. And I'll be honest, that 16 acres is probably ambitious. This is Wilkerson Nature Preserve, which is surrounded pretty much on all sides by residential areas. There's some commercial areas not too far away, and there are some heavy transportation routes as well. So in order to make sure our smoke management and our public safety are highest priorities, then we have to sort of subdivide and make these units as small as we can. On the right, you can see another burn unit we did at Lake Johnson, where you have all this land there, and we were able to burn this itty bitty 2-acre tract. And big reason for that is if you look down to the southwest of that little red burn unit, you'll see Interstate 40 was right there. So fortunately, we had Lake Johnson to the north and to the northwest where we could push the smoke, but we couldn't have bit off much of a bigger chunk in order to make sure we weren't going to put Interstate 40 in jeopardy. All this goes back to wildland urban interface. It increases that complexity. It makes the timing and precision of your burning so much more important. And because of where we are and the resources available, it makes sharing those resources even more important. So the city of Raleigh doesn't have its own internal fire program yet. We are working on developing that. But for the time being, when we conduct controlled burns, we rely on the North Carolina Forest Service to come in and do the controlled burns for us because they have the qualified staff, they have the equipment, they have the tools and the know-how, and the regulatory authority, frankly, in order to come in there and do it all for us. So for the time being, we're relying on partners like them. Wake County has offered to help lend us some resources as well, until the point where we can start conducting some of these small scale burns on our own. One of the big problems at the local level when it comes to prescribed fire is that public perception and the need to educate the public on why you're lighting these fires in the woods or in these fields anyway. It's the first question they're going to want to know is why, what's the benefit of burning this land, and how does that outweigh the risk to the public? And there's a lot that goes into that. It's never a simple answer, but in order to improve that public perception and to increase that public awareness, we have numerous educational campaigns, programs, different things like that, initiatives that we put into place to help spread the word and to help people feel more comfortable with this management action, because it is new and it can be scary for some people, especially when we're burning a tract, that's right next door to their neighborhood or even to their home. So that plays a big part at the local level. All right, folks, we're going to wrap it up. And this is kind of, this is where we tie those sliding scales all back together, right? How can you tell which level of management is best? Which level is most effective? Which level deserves more resources? And I'll go ahead and tell you it's a trick question because there is no right answer. Every level of management, sort of like a cake, helps support the next layer above it. And as the layers make it smaller, that doesn't make them less important. At the federal land management scale, we're talking about landscape management. We're talking about ecological services, such as air quality, water quality, flood control, wildlife habitat, pollination. Like all these things are huge ecological services that are provided at this landscape scale, and the federal land management or the federal land agencies have to do a lot to make sure that these processes stay intact. We talked about the migrations earlier as well, and the federal agencies are typically our first level of prevention when it comes to the introduction of a new invasive plant species or a degrading source, pollution from corporations or industries, for example. So they can help provide that outermost layer of protection. And then you move to the state level, which is that next layer up on the cake, where depending on the state you're in, there is still some landscape scale management that provides, almost landscape scale ecological services. Again, with your air quality, water quality, pollinators, flood control, stormwater control. At the state level, you're also looking at your protections for plants and wildlife because states are better equipped to keep an eye on those things than at the federal level. So even if the federal level has said, hey, this plant or this animal is now legally protected, it's up to the state then maybe to then identify where those populations are and to enact even more specific regulations. This goes to the next bullet, their regulatory and oversight responsibilities. They build on those that are established by the federal level, and hopefully take that a step further to help ensure that the protections are there for the different plants and wildlife we have. Finally, at the smallest level, us little guys at the local level, habitats and corridors. I can't hammer that enough. Because of the level of urbanization that we have here and the rapidly expanding level of urbanization we have in other areas, we have to continue to provide habitat. And we have to continue to make sure that habitat is connected to other habitat in order to make sure that plants, animals, and ecosystem services are still intact. More local ecological services are stuff like flood control, stormwater control, which those of you who live in Raleigh over the past week or so, we got another reminder about all this impervious surface area we have that leads to this flash flooding. If we had more of our sort of green space and natural infrastructure in place, we could help reduce some of these by having the green areas, the trees, the plants that uptake some of this water, reduces velocity, it slows down some of the sedimentation and erosion issues. So that's another huge layer that then fits on the next cake. And lastly, it goes, at the municipal level, you're always balancing your land protections and your land management with how the land is being used, whether that's your proximity to the wildland urban interface, whether that's future developments for what's going to happen to that land, There's a lot more moving pieces and stakeholders at that level. It takes a more intimate knowledge of how these pieces work together in order to actively achieve your management goals. So, it's all sort of slotted, one above each other. Everything helps support the next level up. And at that finest level, at the local level, that's where some of you can have the greatest impact. And that kind of leads me into my last slide. Whether you are federal, state, or local government and you're managing public lands, you would not be able to achieve your goals without partnerships. Whether that's the interagency within your own agency or interagency with other agencies, or intraagency, which is within your own agency at the federal, state, or local level to accomplish your goals, or it's partnering with non-government organizations, conservation organizations, land trust, private landowners is a huge deal, different corporations and businesses, and also with colleges and universities that have helped lead a lot of collaborative research projects. They help provide additional funding and other resources. But going back to my main point is community partnerships and education. This is where at the local level we can have the greatest impact, I think, and where many of our resources should be directed. Community partnerships can include volunteer events. One example we have here in Raleigh is the Neighborhood Ecology Corps that targets young children in middle school and sort of introduces them to different natural resource topics and environmental management ideas. And Youth Conservation Corps, which is sort of the next step up for your high school and early college age kids, where we actually allow them to participate in some of these management actions. And lastly, education and outreach is critical. The public needs to be aware and they need to understand what sort of management and restoration activities you're doing. It also provides a certain level of transparency. I think that's required for us as government agents managing public lands using public resources. It's important that the public knows what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. Every single agency, whether it's BLM, whether it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife, North Carolina Forest Service, any of those agencies I named before and many that I didn't, every agency commits some amount of resources to education and outreach because it's just that important. And those resources could come in the form of online materials, different workshops that get offered, different interpretive programs, educational programs that can be offered on site, and even as simple as just having informative signage at the property that helps explain to the public what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. Goes a long, long way to help you achieve your goals at any level, at any scale. All right, so I think you've heard me talk long enough. Thank y'all for listening. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody. But I'm going to leave this slide up, get ready to take some questions. And you can grab my contact info down there. You see my email address at the very bottom. If you guys don't have a question now, or you think of one later, or you want to send one directly, feel free to reach out to me through that email address, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So I'm going to go ahead and close the screen down just so I can see folks. All right. I think that did it. All right, folks.
Hey, Sean, I'll ask a question. I'm not scared. Oh, I got a question for you. You're talking about ecological monitoring and agencies conducting biological surveys, and they're looking for rare or protected species. What would be an example of some of these species you might find in, say, our area, the Piedmont area?
So in our area, in the Neuse River especially, we have a lot of neat stuff. A lot of them are freshwater bivalves, like mussels. We have like the Neuse River water dog, Carolina mad tom. Those are some examples for aquatics. Up in terrestrially speaking, we do have some protected species like bald eagles. Even though they're no longer listed as endangered, they are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. As far as some plants go, I see that Brian England is on this call, and Brian England actually found a state endangered plant for us at a couple of our sites. That's the bottomland skullcap, which is a really pretty wildflower that I don't think we knew we had at several of these sites. And through ecological monitoring and having somebody on the ground who knew what they were looking for, we were able to identify it and put some protections in place. Sure, I'm forgetting of several dozen other ones, but the Piedmont region, because of the level of urbanization and past land use, probably has a lower concentration of what we consider protected or rare. When you go out to the mountains or towards the coast, either direction, or even down towards the sandhills, those numbers start to pick up a little bit more.
Very cool. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, no problem. All right, any other questions? I just realized that I went 20 minutes over time. I apologize for that. But happy to stick around and take questions for as long as anybody wants to. All right, I must have done a really good job. I guess I answered all of them. I know that was tedious and there's a lot of information there. But I think it's really important, for people to understand how agencies work, and especially how they work together and how they support, the different levels, all the way down to the finest scale, because that's where we as individuals can have the greatest impact. So just like it goes from top down, from federal to state to local, we can make it go from bottom up, in terms of grassroots movements, community organizations, community initiatives, stuff like that. So that's something, at least speaking from Raleigh Park's perspective, that's something we're really trying to pay a lot of attention to and invest some time and resources in. Yep, you're welcome.